Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Vicksburg? Wow, that's impressive. Well, I can assure you, if you come back again, you'll see something new and different. But for those of you who have never been to Vicksburg, you're in for a real treat. Vicksburg National Military Park was established by the Congress back in 1899 to commemorate the campaign, siege, and defense of Vicksburg. It was the 5th Civil War battlefield to be set aside in perpetuity by the Congress, making it only the 7th national park. Today we have more than 430 units of our national park system, and so in Vicksburg we have one of the oldest, one of the largest, and one of the most heavily visited of our nation's historic sites. Now, when the park was established by the Congress, the enabling legislation provides for monumentation. It's a state responsibility to erect monuments, and there were 28 states north and south represented by combat troops during the Vicksburg campaign. All 28 of those states, including, of course, Minnesota, have erected state memorials. But the monuments of stone and bronze that you'll see at Vicksburg were executed by the foremost American and European sculptors of the late 19th, early 20th century, and have collectively made Vicksburg, in the words of one Civil War veteran, the art park of the world. Today there are more than 1,380 monuments, markers, tablets, and plaques at Vicksburg, making it one of the more densely monumented battlefields in all the world. You'll also see the remains of the U.S. ironclad gunboat Cairo, one of the City Series ironclads that John talked about earlier, that had been torpedoed and sunk in water off of Vicksburg in December of 1862. Raised in 1964, it's on display today in the park. You can actually walk on the gun deck, and the museum adjacent to it houses on display more than 1,000 artifacts of the more than 25,000 artifacts recovered from the gunboat. So you're in for a real treat. This afternoon we're going to talk about failures of the Confederate High Command in the defense of Vicksburg. Unity of command is one of the 9 principles of war recognized the world over. FM 100-5, the Army's Manual on Operations, states, in both the operation and tactical dimensions, it is axiomatic that the employment of military forces in a manner that develops their full combat power requires unity of command. Although straightforward sounding, the Army considers it necessary to define that concept for those who find it difficult to grasp. Unity of command means directing and coordinating the action of all forces toward a common goal or objective, reads the manual, which goes on to provide guidance for achieving this desired principle. Coordination may be achieved by vesting a single commander with the requisite authority to direct and to coordinate all forces employed in the pursuit of a common goal. Although the 9 principles of war were not codified by the United States Army until 1921, these very same principles guided the armies of the North and South during the Civil War, and generals in blue and gray understood and applied many of these principles in much the same way as do officers of the present-day Army. Thus, it is difficult to fathom why Confederate civil and military authorities failed to grasp or exercise this key principle in operations along the Mississippi River, and especially in defense of the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, Vicksburg. 2 seemingly unrelated events, which occurred in 1862, ensured that unity of command would not be realized by those responsible for the defense of Vicksburg. These events combined to have tragic consequences for the Confederacy as they helped seal the doom of Vicksburg long before Union forces launched the campaign that resulted in surrender of the river bastion on July 4, 1863. The fall of the fortress city was a staggering blow to the Confederacy, as it resulted in loss of the Mississippi River and separated the vast trans-Mississippi region from the southern heartland. The loss of Vicksburg shattered hopes for Southern independence, and when coupled with the defeat of General Robert E. Lee's vaunted Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg that same time, marked the turning point of the Civil War. Although the war raged for 21 months longer, the summer of disaster ultimately resulted in the fall of Vicksburg and was prelude to the inevitability of Appomattox that brought to a close the greatest tragedy in American history. Remarkably, most works on the Vicksburg campaign make no mention of these events or fail to demonstrate their association with one another and the impact they had on military events in the lower Mississippi River Valley in 1863. Yet they are central to an appreciation of the complexities of the Vicksburg campaign, and especially to an understanding of the three men most directly responsible for the tragedy of errors that failed to achieve concert of action and resulted in the fall of Vicksburg. And I suspect you can guess who these three men are. Permit me to begin this afternoon by introducing you to the cast of leading characters in this tragedy that regrettably lacks Shakespearean romance and nobility. In order of appearance, they are Jefferson Davis, Joseph E. Johnston, and John C. Pemberton. These three men are certainly no strangers to you, and each brings to this tragedy their own unique levels of incompetence, stupidity, and ignorance. Jefferson Davis, a native Kentuckian who was more closely associated with the Magnolia State, was the 10th and final child born of Samuel Henry Davis and his wife, the former Jane Cook. Raised near Woodville, Mississippi, Davis enjoyed the benefits and lifestyles of one of Mississippi's leading families. Educated, among other places, at Jefferson College near Natchez and Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, Davis secured an appointment to the United States Military Academy. Although he compiled a good academic record at West Point, he also accrued demerits by the score, and on more than one occasion found himself on the brink of dismissal from the academy. Survive, however, he did, and at time of graduation in 1828 stood 23rd out of 33 cadets. Commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry, Davis experienced routine assignments to various frontier posts and even some action against Indians. In 1832, the young lieutenant received the surrender of the Sauk chief Black Hawk, and escorted him from Wisconsin Territory to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. During this trip, the two men got acquainted, and Black Hawk, perhaps sensing something of Davis's fate, commented of the future Confederate president that he was a good and brave young chief. In 1835, Davis resigned from the Army and married Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of his former commanding officer, General Zachary Taylor. But tragedy soon struck as both fell victim to malaria, and Knoxie, as Jefferson Davis affectionately called his bride, died. Although Davis himself recovered, he was permanently impaired by the disease. He was blind in one eye and deaf in one ear. Heartbreaking, he returned to Briarfield, his plantation home on the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg, and there remained in seclusion for almost 10 years. He applied himself to farming, and with the help of his older brother Joseph, became a full member of the planter elite. When Davis finally emerged from mourning, he remarried and was elected to Congress. At the outbreak of the war with Mexico, he resigned his seat, took up the sword, and became colonel of the 1st Mississippi Rifles. Davis and his men won renown at the Battle of Buena Vista, where he was wounded in the foot. He returned to Mississippi a hero and was appointed to the United States Senate to fill an unexpired term and served as chairman of the prestigious Military Committee. Although elected senator in his own right in 1850, he soon resigned to seek the governorship of Mississippi. In a close election during which he espoused the need for a unified South committed to protecting its rights under the Constitution, he lost to the moderate Henry Foote. Destined for public life, however, Davis in 1852 became Secretary of War in the administration of Franklin Pierce and ran the War Department with efficiency. His tenure as Secretary was characterized by the remarkably progressive improvements he made to the Army. Returning to the Senate in 1857, Davis became an eloquent spokesman for Southern interest, yet only reluctantly came to embrace secession. Upon the secession of Mississippi, Davis resigned his seat with a heavy heart and left Washington. He was appointed a major general by Governor John J. Pettus and given command of the Army of Mississippi, a position infinitely to his liking. However, he was quickly overshadowed by the storm clouds that engulfed the nation and was elected president of the newly established Confederate States of America. At his inauguration in Montgomery, William L. Yancey of Alabama declared of Davis that the man and the hour have met. His bold proclamation was premature. As Commander-in-Chief, Davis sought to fight a defensive war and hold every inch of the Confederacy. This, of course, required spreading limited manpower and resources over a vast area, and, as events would prove, have disastrous consequences for the Southern nation. Davis's views on strategy were not shared by many of his generals whom he appointed. Among those opposed to the president's view was Joseph E. Johnston, who became one of Davis's most outspoken critics. Born in Virginia in 1807, Johnston was the son of a distinguished soldier of the Revolution who had served with Light Horse Harry Lee in the Southern Department. Following in his father's footsteps, Johnston secured a cadetship at West Point, from which he graduated in 1829, the same class as Robert E. Lee, and a year behind Davis, standing 13th in a class of 46 cadets. Johnston developed a reputation as a brave and competent officer. Wounded twice in action against the Seminole Indians and 5 times during the Mexican War, the Virginian rose steadily through the ranks and was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the 1st U.S. Cavalry in 1855. As the nation drifted to the brink of civil war, Johnston was elevated to brigadier general and appointed quartermaster general of the Army. When hostilities between the states erupted, Johnston resigned his commission and offered his sword first to Virginia, then to the Confederacy. As the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army to resign his commission, he fully expected to be named top general in the Confederacy. We know that he wasn't. It was a blow to his extremely sensitive and large ego when 3 men he considered his junior were placed above them in seniority. Does anybody know who those 3 men are? First, Samuel Cooper, Inspector General. He's number 1 general in the Confederacy. Number 2, Albert Sidney Johnston, killed at the Battle of Shiloh. Number 3, Robert E. Lee. Johnston was number 4. This rankled Johnston, whose jealousy and resentment could not be disguised, and during the war he formed a bitter and acrimonious relationship with the Confederate president. Despite the obvious strained relations resulting from Johnston's bruised ego, Davis appointed him to command the Southern forces that assembled at Harper's Ferry. What in retrospect could have been construed as an omen, Johnston concluded that Harper's Ferry could not be held, and he evacuated the strategic town. This pattern of operations would be followed through a string of cities and towns throughout the war, for Johnston believed in sacrificing geography to mass available manpower to form large armies with which to do battle and win independence by force of arms. Although Johnston basked in the glory gained at First Manassas, the president's confidence in his abilities continued to wane as the spring of 1862 witnessed his army's steady retreat up the peninsula toward Richmond. It proved fortunate for Davis and the Confederacy that Johnston was badly wounded in the Battle of Fair Oaks on May 31st. Incapacitated, he was replaced by Robert E. Lee, and Johnston would never again command the principal Confederate army in Virginia. While recuperating from his wound, Johnston continued his attacks against Davis and fell in with those who opposed the president's politically. Most notable was Senator Louis T. Wigfall of Texas, in whose house Johnston recuperated. Due to these attacks against him, Davis only reluctantly appointed the general to a command when he reported fit for duty in November. Johnston was assigned to command the Department of the West, a broad geographic area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. It was hoped that Johnston could coordinate the movements of the armies of General Braxton Bragg in Tennessee and Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton in Mississippi. Contrary to statements relative to his condition to return to duty, Johnston was still not fully recovered physically. And I submit to you, good people, that he was not well mentally either. For as desperate a wound as he had received at Fair Oaks was bound to take some fight out of anyone. And as the general was unwilling to support the president's strategic plan for this department, it is clear that Johnston's heart was never in this role. His actions would be to everyone's dissatisfaction, except his own. The third and final member of our cast is Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, who commanded the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana from headquarters in the capital city of Jackson. A native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he was born on August 10, 1814. Although of Quaker stock, John grew quite active socially and enjoyed parties, dances, and the theater. Yet he was a quiet young man who shied away from intimacy and counted few close friends. It may interest you to learn that among his closest boyhood friends was no less an individual than George Gordon Meade, who was destined to command the Union Army that gained the victory at Gettysburg. In fact, if you go to Philadelphia today, these two men are buried within just a few yards of one another. After entering the University of Pennsylvania, John sought an appointment to the United States Military Academy in order to study civil engineering. President Andrew Jackson, a close friend of Pemberton's father, gladly awarded the appointment on May 15, 1833, and John embarked on a military career. At West Point, Pemberton was an average cadet who did not excel academically and, like Davis, accrued the merits by the score. At one point during his first class or senior year, he was arrested for breaking academy regulations dealing with the possession of liquor. Only after the entire class signed a pledge not to drink for the remaining days at the academy were the charges against him dropped. John went on to complete the rigorous curriculum of West Point, and at graduation stood 27 out of 50 cadets in the class of 1837. Pemberton was assigned to duty with the 4th United States Artillery, in which he served during the Second Seminole War and in the Mexican War. In Mexico, the young lieutenant saw action under Zachary Taylor in the early engagements of the war at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Matamoros. He later served as an aide-de-camp on the staff of General William J. Worth in the campaign for Monterey and during the drive on Mexico City. Pemberton proved himself a brave and energetic officer of whom his superiors took notice. His actions on the field of battle at Monterey and Molino del Rey earned him 2 brevets for gallant and meritorious conduct. The laurels won in Mexico would be the proudest achievements of his long military career. Shortly after his return from Mexico, Pemberton married Martha Thompson of Norfolk, Virginia. Devoted to one another, their marriage was one of bliss and produced 7 children. Patty, the name by which Pemberton affectionately called his wife, was a beautiful yet domineering woman who held tremendous sway over her husband. As the nation drifted to the brink of civil war, John was torn between love of country and love for his wife. Upon the secession of Virginia, Patty wrote John from Norfolk, "My darling husband, why are you not with us? Why do you stay? Jefferson Davis has a position for you." Pemberton biographer Michael Ballard asserts that Patty had made clear where her heart lay, and he would never have turned against her. On April 24, 1861, John Pemberton resigned his commission as captain in the United States Army and offered his sword to her native state, Virginia. Governor John Letcher of Virginia quickly nominated Pemberton to be a lieutenant colonel in the state forces. Less than 2 months later, the northern-born Pemberton was made brigadier general in the Confederate Army. John's rapid rise was based more on the need for experienced officers than merited by his abilities. This trend continued as he was promoted Major General to rank from January 14, 1862, and later that same year to the grade of Lieutenant General, or equivalent of 3-star rank. During this period, Pemberton gained administrative experience as he served briefly in the Virginia Tidewater, then as commander of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia. In the fall of 1862, with little useful field or combat experience, he was named commander of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana and left for our rendezvous with destiny at Vicksburg. Responsible for the defense of Mississippi River and the twin bastions of Vicksburg and Port Hudson, Pemberton had little time to acquaint himself with his new command, as federal forces were already active within his department. His administrative abilities were quickly taxed to the limit, as the needs of his department were many and the resources few. Effective departmental operations were further plagued by a myriad of problems: poor staff work, mediocre subordinates, inadequate rail transportation, lack of troops, especially cavalry, and the necessities of food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition were in woefully short supply. Although Pemberton immersed himself in the administrative details of departmental command, it was combat abilities that were of greater need by the Confederacy. In that regard, however, events would soon demonstrate that John Pemberton had been promoted way beyond his capacities to command. With our cast of characters in place, let's examine the two events that combined to have such dramatic impact on the Confederacy and the valiant struggle made by the Southern people for independence. Our opening scene is set in Charleston, South Carolina. The curtain opens on March 14, 1862, when then Major General John C. Pemberton was assigned permanent command of the Department of South Carolina in Georgia. Demonstrating his penchant for managerial manipulation, Pemberton, who had replaced Robert E. Lee as departmental commander, began an inextricable reorganization that blossomed into an unnecessarily complex bureaucracy. Biographer Ballard asserts that Pemberton's style as chief administrator of the department complemented his command structure. He became bogged down in the minutiae of details. He paid too much attention to matters that were normally taken care of by a general staff. To combat compound matters, his staff lacked the experience and cohesiveness required for effective operations. In the aftermath of Shiloh, and during the 7 days' battles, manpower drainage from his department caused Pemberton to constrict his defenses, which led to local unease. Adhering to Lee's principle that holding lines was far more important than protecting outlying areas, Pemberton removed cannon and men from across his department to better defend the key cities of Charleston and Savannah. Such action served to enrage those who lived in the affected areas and caused alarm among the state's elected officials. His resort to martial law without adequate emergency was viewed as insensitive and worked to undermine the confidence that those he defended had in him. He approached his job from purely a military point of view and failed to grasp that public support and morale are necessary to favorable military results. Pemberton's diplomatic skills have been termed as unspectacular. Thus, it will come as no surprise that his strained relations with local and state officials, especially Governor Francis Pickens and the citizens of Charleston, aggravated his problems in South Carolina. These relations steadily deteriorated as he abandoned more of the coastal areas without prior notification to the civilian authorities and began to espouse the belief that Charleston itself was untenable and recommended that forts, including Sumter, be dismantled. In a note to Jefferson Davis, Governor Pickens complained of Pemberton and the situation, writing, "I fear Charleston is to be sacrificed by total incompetency in the officer commanding and a total want of knowledge of the country." In response to the clamor that steadily poured into Richmond from disgruntled South Carolinians, Davis instructed his military advisor, General Lee, to counsel with Pemberton. The importance of defending both Charleston and Savannah to the last extremity, particularly Charleston, is earnestly brought to your attention, wrote Lee on May 29, 1862. He emphasized to the Pennsylvanian in gray, "Let it be distinctly understood by everybody that Charleston and Savannah are to be defended to the last extremity. If the harbors are taken, the cities are to be fought street by street and house by house, as long as we have a foot of ground to stand upon." Although Pemberton earnestly worked to improve the situation by strengthening the fortifications around Charleston, it was clear to all concerned that it was time for him to go. Once the decision to replace Pemberton had been made, the search for a suitable replacement began. Due to the delicate situation that existed in Charleston and the limited number of candidates then available, it was not until August 29th that Pemberton was replaced by General P.G.T. Beauregard. Pemberton was pleased to leave Charleston, but he did so with his confidence shaken and his reputation somewhat tarnished. But the President stood by him and reassigned the general to command of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. He departed Charleston in late September, and the following month arrived at his new command in Jackson. It is important to further note Now, when Pemberton assumed command of his new department, he was ordered by the President to report directly to him or to Secretary of War James A. Seddon. These orders were never rescinded, even after Davis appointed Johnston to supreme command in the West, and this would have serious repercussions on the Confederate defense of Vicksburg. The second scene of our great tragedy is set in Vicksburg itself in December 1862. President Davis, responding to a request from Governor John J. Pettus that he visit Mississippi to help bolster the flagging morale of the people, traveled to his home state. In order to help familiarize Johnston with his new department, Davis requested that the general accompany him on this trip. The presidential party arrived in Vicksburg on the evening of December the 19th and was greeted by polite cheers. The two men spent the next 2 days inspecting the city's fortifications, and then went on to inspect Pemberton's army, then at Grenada in North Mississippi, contesting the overland advance of Grant's Union Army. Returning to Jackson, Davis addressed the legislature in the Capitol the day after Christmas. Whatever fortunes I may have achieved in life have been gained as a representative of Mississippi, he began, and before all I have labored for the advancement of her glory and honor. The President spoke with eloquence. I now, for the first time in my career, find myself the representative of a wider circle of interest, but a circle of which the interests of Mississippi are still embraced. For although in the discharge of my duties as President of the Confederate States, I had determined to make no distinction between the various parts of the country, to know no separate state, yet my heart has always beat more warmly for Mississippi, and I have looked upon Mississippi soldiers with a pride and emotion such as no others inspired. The legislators listened intently for any indication of how the government, and especially Davis himself, planned to assist the people of Mississippi in their hour of need, but only rhetoric flowed from his lips. This was the land of my affections, Davis continued. Here were situated the little of worldly goods I possessed. But when I received dispatches and heard rumors of alarm and trepidation and despondency among the people of Mississippi, when I heard even that people were fleeing to Texas in order to save themselves from the enemy, when I saw it stated by the enemy that they had handled other states with gloves, but Mississippi was to be handled without gloves, every impulse of my heart dragged me hither, in spite of duties which might have claimed my attentions elsewhere. When I heard of the suffering of my own people, of the danger of their subjugation by a ruthless foe, I felt that if Mississippi were destined for such a fate, I would wish to sleep in her soil. His grand and flowery phrases were meaningless, and the hopes of his listeners faded. The only statement of substance was a pledge to order additional pieces of heavy ordnance to Vicksburg, which all knew was not enough. Davis assured those who crowded the House chamber that I can then say with every confidence that our condition is in every respect greatly improved over what it was last year. The President concluded his remarks with a statement hardly worthy of confidence. I shall go away from you with a lighter heart, anxious but hopeful. Although his speech was received with polite applause, it certainly failed to assuage the fears of Mississippians who braced themselves for what was to follow. As the applause slowly ebbed, shouts of "Johnston! Johnston!" rang out. The general, who normally shied away from public appearances, slowly approached the podium and addressed the audience in his customary manner. Fellow citizens, my only regret is that I have done so little to merit such a greeting, he said, and proclaimed, I promise you, however, that hereafter I shall be watchful, energetic, and indefatigable in your defense. Events would certainly prove otherwise. What made the inspection tour so significant were the impressions it left in the mind of each man. Davis was impressed by the scope and strength of the fortifications that ringed Vicksburg and declared them strong, formidable. Indeed, he thought they could never be taken. Thus, during the course of the campaign, and especially throughout the long period of siege, despite increasingly gloomy reports emanating from Mississippi, the Confederate president harbored little fear of the loss of Vicksburg. A Davis biographer wrote that the president was strangely uninvolved in the affairs centered on Vicksburg. Believing the city to be an impregnable fortress and that time was on his side, Davis failed to heed the warnings, sent few reinforcements, and concentrated his attentions on the campaigns in the East. In fact, Davis was shocked in July when he received word of the city's surrender. Incredulous, he asked repeatedly of those around him, how could this be possible? Unlike Davis, Johnston was unimpressed by the fortifications, quite the contrary. He was disturbed that they embraced what he termed the usual error of Confederate engineering. He expressed fears that Vicksburg was nothing but an immense entrenched camp requiring an army to hold it had been made instead of a fort requiring a small garrison. He compared Vicksburg to Fort Donelson, stating that it was nothing but an elaborate trap that would ensnare its defenders, and warned that if an army ever fell back into these defenses and allowed itself to be besieged, you could write it off. It was as good as lost. Consequently, with Davis focused on events elsewhere, and Johnston unwilling to accept the mantle of command thrust upon him by the president, Pemberton was left to defend Vicksburg with plenty of contradictory advice, but precious little support from his superiors. Left to his own devices, Pemberton, in predictable fashion, managed his new department in much the same way he did at Charleston and experienced many of the same difficulties, especially in dealing with elected officials and civilian populations. However, with Lee's admonition always in mind, he was determined to defend Vicksburg and Fort Hudson to the last extremity, fighting street by street, house by house, if need be. The final scene of our great drama is played out during the campaign itself. Following Grant's landing at Bruinsburg, the situation facing Confederate forces in Mississippi quickly went from bad to worse. Davis ordered Johnston to the Magnolia State with orders to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. Upon his arrival in Jackson on May 13th, the day before Union forces stormed the capital city, he quickly assessed the situation and informed the Secretary of War, "I am too late." This statement was a reflection of the defeatism that has forever tarnished his Civil War career and came to characterize his operations to relieve Vicksburg. Rather than fight to save Jackson, Johnston ordered the city's evacuation, which effectively removed him and his army from the campaign. In the general's defense, however, it must be said that at the time of the evacuation, he only had 6,000 men in Jackson. However, Confederate reinforcements were en route to the capital city, and by late afternoon, his numbers would have swelled to 10,000, with an additional 3,000 men expected on May 16th. In light of expected reinforcements that would only have placed him at a 1-2 disadvantage, it is difficult to fathom why Johnston failed to prolong the fight for Jackson. As Johnston and his small force marched to the northeast towards Canton, he directed Pemberton to rendezvous with him at Clinton, where, united, they could turn on Grant and defeat the Federal Army in detail. But neither general moved toward that end. Rather, they marched in opposite directions and left the initiative with Grant, and he was a most dangerous man with whom to lead the initiative. Then, in the aftermath of the disasters at Champion Hill and Big Black River Bridge, May 16 and 17, Johnston ordered Pemberton, "If it is not too late, evacuate Vicksburg and its dependencies and march to the northeast." Recalling his inspection tour in December, the Virginian warned his subordinate, "If you are invested in Vicksburg, you must ultimately surrender. Under such circumstances, instead of losing both troops and place, we must, if possible, save the troops." Pemberton, however, would reply that "I am ordered to hold Vicksburg at all cost, and I intend to do just that," and he remained inside the city's defenses. Faced with the decision to evacuate the city and save his army, but lose Vicksburg, or fall back into and man the city's fortifications, Pemberton opted for the latter. The soldiers under his command were thus destined to experience war in all its horror during the long 47-day siege of the city, trapped in a terrifying quest for survival. On May 19th, and again on the 22nd. Grant hurled his forces against the city's defenses, only to be easily and bloodily repulsed. Settling into a war of attrition, Union forces encircled Vicksburg and worked to starve the garrison into submission. In order to conserve what food supplies were on hand, Pemberton ordered the daily ration cut to 3/4, then to half, then to quarter. And as mentioned previously, rations were then cut again, and yet again, and yet again. By the end of June, the garrison was issued only a handful of peas and rice per man per day. Even their water would be rationed to 1 cup per man per day. In Vicksburg, the weeks slowly passed. Lieutenant William A. Drennan, a member of the besieged garrison, described life in the city with the following notation in his diary. Monotony does not convey all the sameness of these days imposes on one. There is a tension of nerves and extreme anxiety as you have experienced for a few moments, and that you have felt, had you to endure it long, it would craze you. 2 days later, he wrote of the scepter which overshadowed the monotony of events in Vicksburg and made the days so difficult to bear. The mortality here at this time is very great. Hardly a day passes, but I see dozens of men carried to their homes. They are buried in a trench with a blanket for their shroud. Coffins cannot be had for all of them. Graves are dug today for use tomorrow. Throughout the month of June, as the Union vice closed ever tighter, communications between Pemberton and Johnston relative to coordinated movements to save the garrison became less frequent. Growing difficulty in exchanging messages between the two generals led to delay that further reduced effective communications. The breakdown in communications would have proved fatal to coordination had coordination truly been the objective. Although the record is clear that Pemberton was desperate to be saved, the record is also clear the evidence that Johnston was equally desperate to avoid action. By June 3rd, the Army of Relief, as Johnston's army came to be known, numbered more than 30,000 strong, which gave the combined Confederate armies a substantial numeric advantage over Grant caught between them. Still, he complained to the authorities in Richmond that he needed more men, more wagons, more horses, more ammunition. The authorities sent what they could, but it was never enough. Johnston needed more. Nothing could spur the Virginian into action. Davis and members of his cabinet urged Johnston to move quickly, but none more forcefully than the Secretary of War, James A. Seddon, who admonished, "Vicksburg must not be lost without a desperate struggle. The interest and honor of the Confederacy forbid it." And yet, to the urging of his superiors and pleading by Pemberton, Johnston would only reply, "I am too weak to save Vicksburg." Whether he was or not, we will never know. But the window of opportunity closed by mid-June as tens of thousands of federal reinforcements arrived in the Vicksburg area that sealed the doom of the beleaguered city. In despair, the Vicksburg commander on June 23rd sent a communication to Johnston suggesting that the Virginian proposed terms for surrender of the city to Grant. Pemberton added, "I will strain every nerve to hold out if there's a hope of our ultimate relief for 15 days longer." Johnston replied on June 27, four precious days later, "Negotiations with Grant for the relief of the garrison, should they become necessary, must be made by you. It would be a confession of weakness on my part, which I ought not to make, to propose them. When it becomes necessary to make terms, they may be considered as made under my authority." I think it's strange his use of the word "when it becomes necessary" rather than "if it becomes necessary." Yet despite knowing of the dire situation in Vicksburg, Johnston delayed another 4 days before he finally set his Jackson force in motion on July the 1st toward the Confederate Gibraltar on the Mississippi. By then, it was too late. On July 3rd, as his advanced units neared the Big Black River east of Vicksburg, an eerie silence settled over the area as the sound of cannonade from Vicksburg ceased. Although only 12 days had passed, rather than the 15 Pemberton had pledged when he penned the dire warning of imminent catastrophe, Johnston knew beyond doubt that the silence indicated the valiant defenders of Vicksburg had reached the limits of human endurance. In fact, at that very moment, Pemberton and Grant sat between the lines in the shade of a stunted oak, and the Confederate commander requested of his opponent the terms by which he would receive the surrender in the city and garrison of Vicksburg. Johnston spent much of July 4th examining the reports sent in by his scouts while his men remained in camp. He realized the futility of attempting to force a crossing of the Big Black River north of the railroad in the face of an entrenched enemy, and reasoned that there might be a soft spot in the federal fortifications somewhere below the tracks. Johnston therefore resolved to explore the region south of the railroad. But before his troops took up the line of march on July 5th, the fears of many were confirmed with the news of Vicksburg's surrender. Fearing that Grant would now turn on him, Johnston determined to fall back on Jackson. Thus, the Army of Relief became an army on the run. Morale within the army sank as the great columns headed east back toward the capital city. The sun beat down unmercifully on the Confederates, and the thick clouds of dust that swirled around the men made it difficult to breathe. Adding to their misery was an acute shortage of water that prevented the men from soothing parched throats. Despite the hardships suffered on the march, the column moved quickly, aware that the Union Army would soon be snapping at its heels. In predictable fashion, Johnston also abandoned Jackson, but in this case it was certainly justified. On July 17th, as his column headed east across the Pearl River, Union soldiers once more filled the streets of Jackson, bringing to a close what was perhaps the most mismanaged campaign in Confederate history. Though Grant deserves all the credit he received for the great triumph at Vicksburg, his victory was due in part to the failure of three men who could not or would not exercise unity of command. Jefferson Davis acted as the proverbial ostrich. He placed his head in the sand and hoped the problem would be solved by those he had charged with the defense of Vicksburg. Joe Johnston was a stubborn mule who, despite orders, refused to budge and could not be coaxed, cajoled, or threatened to move. Permit me to be so bold as to suggest to you that Johnston realized that if he permitted Vicksburg to fall without making an attempt to save the city and its garrison, his military reputation would be destroyed and his career finished. And yet he did not want to face Grant's forces in pitched battle. Thus he delayed as long as he thought prudent to save his reputation without risking the possibility of battle. And finally, John Pemberton, the Pennsylvanian in gray who was plagued by indecision. In his attempt to serve two masters, Davis and Johnston, he failed both, and in so doing brought disaster and disgrace upon himself and the Confederacy. Time, however, heals most things, and the bitter feeling engendered by the war and the Reconstruction period that followed mellowed. In 1917, approximately 8,000 veterans of the blue and gray attended what was known as the National Memorial Celebration and Peace Jubilee held on the grounds of the National Park at Vicksburg. On the final day of the reunion, there was a parade in Vicksburg during which the aged veterans rode in trucks through the city streets that were lined by thousands of spectators. The city was festooned with red, white, and blue bunting, which of course represented both sides during the course of the conflict, and pictures of our heroes, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Jefferson Davis, and Robert E. Lee. Conspicuous by the absence of their pictures were Joseph E. Johnston and John C. Pemberton, the two generals who conducted the defense of Vicksburg. As evidenced by the ever-expanding field of literature on the Vicksburg campaign, history is harsh on those who fail. History can also be brutally cold toward those who blunder. The greater the failure, the more intense the cold. Mercifully, though, history can also forget and forgive. But in the case of the Confederate High Command, especially the two generals responsible for the defense and relief of Vicksburg, history has all but forgotten. For John C. Pemberton, the general who tried and failed, and Joseph E. Johnston, the general who failed to try, it remains to be seen if history will ever forgive. And with that, I thank you.